The dust of Harmony Creek settled on everything. A fine tan powder that coated windowsills clung to the brim of a man's hat and muted the very sunlight pouring through the tall windows of the bank. It was a quiet kind of dust, the sort that spoke of long dry summers and promises that had withered on the vine. Inside, the air smelled of old paper-oiled wood and the faint metallic tang of coin. Jacob Boone stood at the teller's window, his broad shoulders seeming to shrink the space around him. He was a man built of timber and iron, his hands calloused from a life spent wrestling a living from an unforgiving land. But at that moment he felt as fragile as spun glass. In his palm lay a silver locket, its surface worn smooth by the touch of thumbs that were no longer there to touch it. It was a simple thing, oval-shaped and unadorned, but it was the last anchor to a world that had vanished. Inside, a miniature portrait of his late wife, Sarah, smiled out at a world she had left too soon. Her eyes, captured in delicate watercolor, held the same light he now saw in their daughter Clara. "It's all I have left of any real value, Mr. Abernathy." Jacob said, his voice a low rumble, sanded rough by disuse. "The drought's taken the north pasture. I lose the herd, I lose the ranch. This loan, it's not for me. It's for my girl." The bank manager, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a question mark, peered at the locket through his spectacles. "It's a beautiful piece, Jacob. But sentiment doesn't pay the bank's investors." He sighed, his gaze softening slightly. "I'll see what I can do. For Sarah's memory and for the child." Relief, cool and sharp, washed through Jacob. He nodded, unable to form the words of thanks. He was closing his hand around the locket, preparing to pass it over, when the front doors of the bank burst inward with a splintering crash. Chaos erupted. Glass shattered. A woman screamed, a sound cut short. 3 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, stormed the room. 2 fanned out their pistols, level, their movements practiced and brutal. They were specters of violence, their presence sucking the quiet, dusty air from the room. But it was the 3rd man, the leader, who commanded the scene. He was taller than the others, his movements possessing a chilling, almost graceful economy. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His eyes, cold and pale above the dark cloth, swept the room with an unnerving intelligence. They were the eyes of a wolf assessing a flock, calculating, devoid of heat or passion. "The vault," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying over the terrified whimpers of the customers and staff. "And the cash drawers. Be quick about it. We are businessmen on a tight schedule." Jacob's first instinct was to shield his body, to become a wall between the violence and the innocent. But he was frozen, his hand clenched so tightly around the silver locket that its edges dug into his palm. It was more than a memento. It was a promise. The robbery unfolded with brutal efficiency. Sacks were filled with currency, gold coins clinking as they were swept from their trays. The leader directed it all with a flick of his wrist, a nod of his head. He seemed almost bored by the proceedings, his gaze drifting over the cowering townsfolk with casual disdain. Then his eyes landed on Jacob. They narrowed. He saw the tension in Jacob's frame, the white-knuckled grip of his hand. The leader strode forward, his boot heels clicking a deliberate, menacing rhythm on the polished floor. He stopped directly in front of Jacob, so close that Jacob could smell the scent of sagebrush and oiled leather clinging to him. "Something to hide, friend?" the leader asked, his voice laced with a silken mockery. Jacob said nothing. His jaw was a knot of stone. The leader's cold eyes flicked down to Jacob's fist. A man shouldn't cling so tightly to material things. It invites disappointment. With a movement too fast to follow, he lashed out. Not with his gun, but with his hand prying Jacob's fingers open. The silver locket fell into his gloved palm. He held it up to the light, turning it over. He didn't try to open it. It was the act of possession that seemed to interest him. A trinket, he mused, his tone dripping with condescension. A memory of some lost love, I imagine. How sentimental. The word was an insult. A knife twisted in a wound Jacob thought was his alone. A low growl rumbled in Jacob's chest. He took a half-step forward, a reckless primal urge to reclaim what was his. The leader smiled, a cruel curl of his lips, visible above the bandana. Ah, there's the fire. I was wondering where it went. He looked from the locket back to Jacob's face, and for a fleeting instant, a flicker of something that looked like recognition or hatred flashed in his cold eyes. Some debts, he said softly, take a lifetime to collect. Before Jacob could process the cryptic words, the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. The butt of the outlaw's pistol connected with his temple. The floorboards rushed up to meet him, the scent of dust and fear filling his senses, before everything dissolved into a deep, silent blackness. His last conscious thought was not of the money or the ranch or even his own life. It was of the silver locket swinging gently from a gloved hand, and the cold, calculating eyes of a man who had not just stolen from him, but had deliberately taken a piece of his soul. Jacob awoke to the scent of antiseptic and the sound of a woman's quiet weeping. The light was a dull gray spear in his eyes, and his head throbbed with a pain so immense it felt as if his skull had been split like firewood. He was on a cot in Dr. Miller's small infirmary, the starched white of a pillowcase scratchy beneath his cheek. "Easy now, son," a gentle voice said. Dr. Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of kindness and worry, placed a cool hand on his shoulder. "You took a nasty knock. It's a miracle your skull isn't fractured." Fragments of memory returned in a sickening rush. The splintering door, the cold eyes, the weight of the pistol. The locket. Jacob's hand flew to his chest, searching the pocket of his shirt. It was empty. The hollow ache that followed was worse than the pounding in his head. "They're gone," and the doctor confirmed, his voice heavy. "Sheriff Brody and a posse went after them, but they vanished into the mesas. Rode like the devil himself was on their heels." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "They cleaned out the bank, Jacob. Wiped it clean. Abernathy says he's ruined. The whole town is." But Jacob barely heard him. The town's misfortune was a distant echo. His loss was immediate, sharp, and deeply personal. It wasn't a random act of violence. The leader's words played over and over in his mind. Some debts take a lifetime to collect. What debt? He had no enemies. He knew of no past quarrels that could warrant such personal cruelty. The man had looked at him, seen him, and chosen to inflict a wound far deeper than any financial ruin. He spent 2 days in the infirmary, his body healing faster than his spirit. The townsfolk who visited spoke in hushed, pitying tones. They talked of their lost savings, of the grim future facing Harmony Creek. But when they looked at Jacob, they saw a different kind of loss. They saw a man who had already been hollowed out by grief, now struck down again. When he was finally steady on his feet, his first stop was not his ranch, but the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but a weary one, his face etched with the failures of a lawman in a territory too vast to tame. "We found their trail," Jacob Brody said, leaning over a map tacked to the wall, "headed south toward the Blackwood territories. But the trail went cold in the canyons. They're ghosts." The leader, Jacob, said, his voice raw. "Did anyone recognize him?" Brody shook his head, masked same as the others. But he was different. Calm. Spoke like an educated man, they said. "Abernathy heard him say something to you before before. He mentioned a debt," Jacob said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. It made no sense. The sheriff studied him, his eyes filled with a weary sympathy. "Sometimes these men don't need a reason, Jacob. They just need an excuse to be cruel. Jacob left the office with a gnawing sense of dissatisfaction. This wasn't random cruelty. This was targeted. The theft of the locket was a message, and he was determined to understand it. He returned to his ranch to find his 3-year-old daughter Clara in the care of a neighbor. Seeing her, his heart cracked. Her golden curls were tangled, her blue eyes wide with a fear she was too young to comprehend. She ran to him, burying her face in his leg, her small body trembling. "Papa hurt," she whispered. He knelt, ignoring the spike of pain in his head, and gathered her into his arms. "Papa's okay, little bird. Papa's here." But as he held her, the full weight of his situation descended upon him. The loan was gone. The bank was bust. The ranch, the only home Clara had ever known, was balanced on a knife's edge. And the man who held the key to his past and his future was a ghost in the wilderness, clutching the last piece of his wife in a gloved hand. That night, as Clara slept, Jacob sat by the fire, and the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls of the cabin he'd built for Sarah. He felt her absence more keenly than ever. Her silence was a presence in the room. He had promised her he would protect this land, protect their child. Now he was failing on both counts. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He couldn't chase a phantom across the territory while caring for a young child. The thought of sending Clara away to distant relatives in the East was a shard of glass in his gut, but what other choice did he have? The pursuit of this man, this ghost, was becoming an obsession. It was the only way to reclaim not just the locket, but the piece of himself that had been stolen with it. His decision made a cold resolve settled in his heart. He would take Clara to the train station in the morning. He would put her on a train east into the care of an aunt she'd never met. And then he would hunt. He would find the man with the cold eyes, and he would understand the meaning of his debt. The winter air lay heavy and sharp across the frontier, hissing through the bare branches of the cottonwoods that lined the road to the station. Each crunch of Jacob's boots on the frozen ruts of the road felt like a step away from his own heart. Clara's small mittened hand was tucked inside his, her quick pattering steps a frantic rhythm against the slow, deliberate march of his grief. The station platform was a lonely outpost on the edge of a vast, white emptiness. A few passengers huddled near the potbelly stove inside the station house, their faces grim. But one figure sat apart from the rest on a bench exposed to the biting wind, as if she had been carved from the sorrow of the place itself. Her shawl was worn thin, her cheeks raw from the cold. A small frayed carpet bag rested at her feet. She sat with a ramrod straightness that defied her desolate circumstances, a woman waiting for a train or a person or a hope that had long since departed. Jacob's focus was singular, a tight knot of purpose in his chest. He had to buy the ticket, say the goodbye he couldn't bear to say, and turn his back on the only light left in his life. But as they drew closer, Clara's steps faltered. She stopped, her small head tilted, her gaze fixed on the solitary woman on the bench. He gave her hand a gentle tug. "Come on, Clara." But she didn't move. Her wide, guileless eyes. Sarah's eyes were filled with a child's profound and uncomplicated empathy. She looked from the woman, a figure of forgotten grace, up to the towering broken man beside her. Then came the question, soft as a breath of frost trembling against the cold air. "Papa," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost missed it, "are we going to sleep without a mother again tonight?" The words were not a question, but a blade. They sliced through the armor of grief and rage he had forged around his heart, laying bare the raw, aching wound beneath. He slowed, his own gaze drawn against his will to the woman on the bench. He saw the flicker of dignity in her posture, and the quiet endurance in the face of what was clearly a public and painful abandonment. Whispers from inside the station house reached him on the wind, scornful, pitying. "Mail order bride? No one came. 3 days she's been waiting. Shame. He recognized it because he felt its bitter cousin humiliation burning in his own gut. Clara tugged on his hand again, her voice barely audible. "Can I call her Mama?" Jacob's jaw tightened. His first instinct was to pull her away, to shield her from a stranger's sorrow, to march forward with his grim task. What right had he to involve another soul in the wreckage of his life? But the child's plea lingered impossible to ignore. It was the cry of a loneliness that mirrored his own. With the unthinking boldness of innocence, Clara let go of his hand and trotted toward the bench. The woman Dessessy Whitlock startled, clutching her shawl tighter as if to ward off another blow. But Clara didn't stop. She reached the bench and pressed her tiny mittened hand against the woman's worn wool skirt. "Mama Clara," asked the word, a simple, hopeful offering. For a moment the woman just stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then a shudder ran through her. Tears, which had perhaps been frozen for days, welled and spilled down her chapped cheeks. She didn't speak. She simply bent down and gathered the small child onto her lap, burying her face in Clara's golden curls as if she were a castaway, clinging to a piece of driftwood. She held the girl with a desperation born of profound loneliness, a silent, powerful communion of two abandoned souls. Jacob stood a few paces away, a giant frozen in place. The world seemed to hold its breath. The whispers from the station ceased. He was no longer just a man on a mission of vengeance. He was a father witnessing a moment of pure, unscripted need. To send Clara away now felt like a cruelty beyond measure, a second abandonment. The path he had set for himself, a lonely hunt for a ghost, suddenly seemed selfish and empty. Vengeance would not keep his daughter warm at night. It would not soothe her fears or sing her to sleep. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over the two figures on the bench. Dessessy looked up, her eyes filled with fear, as if expecting him to snatch the child away to cast her out again. But Jacob said nothing. He had lived in silence for so long that it was his most natural language. Instead, he extended his hand palm up. It was a large hand roughened by years of hard labor, mapped with scars and calluses. It was not an offer of love or even of comfort. It was a silent, practical question. An unspoken choice: come with us or remain here. Dessessy stared at his hand, her breath catching in her throat. The shame of 3 days of public humiliation warred with the impossible warmth of the child in her arms. Clara's small arms tightened around her neck, a silent vote of confidence. With a trembling hand, Dessessy reached out and placed her fingers in his. His grip was firm, steady, a wordless assurance. He helped her to her feet, his other hand going to his carpet bag. Clara remained nestled against Dessessy's shoulder, her eyes drooping with a sudden peaceful exhaustion. Together, the three of them turned and walked away from the station, leaving the whispers and the pity behind them. They formed an unlikely procession, a broken man, a forsaken woman, and the child who had with a single word bound their solitary fates together. The road to the Boone Ranch stretched before them, a white ribbon winding toward an unknown future. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob Boone was not walking it alone. The cabin, stark against the snow-covered prairie, awaited them. It was a structure built of necessity, its lines hard and uncompromising, much like the man who had built it. Jacob pushed the heavy door open and gestured for Dessessy to enter. Inside, the air was cool but held the lingering scent of wood smoke and pine. A muted glow from the hearth's embers cast long shadows across the single large room. Dessessy stepped inside her movements, hesitant, as if she were crossing the threshold into a world she had no right to occupy. She lowered Clara onto a thick quilt near the fire, and then, with an instinctive grace, she began to move. She didn't wait for instruction. She hung her thin shawl to dry, stoked the embers back to life, and found a pot to warm some broth she discovered in the larder. She smoothed the wrinkles from Clara's dress, her hands gentle and sure. She moved with the quiet purpose of someone long accustomed to making a space for herself where none was offered. Jacob watched from a corner, his silence a heavy blanket in the room. He had not asked her name, nor she his. He had not explained the brutal bruise on his temple or the haunted look in his eyes. He had offered a hand, and she had taken it. It was the most profound conversation he'd had in a year. He saw the way she tucked a stray curl behind Clara's ear, the way her own lips trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. She was a ghost in his house, a stranger caring for his child, and yet her presence began to fill the empty spaces he had long since stopped noticing. There was a softness in the way she moved, a tenderness that the cabin had not known since Sarah's death. But outside the cabin's sturdy walls, the world remained unkind. The next morning, Jacob rode into town for supplies, leaving DeCessie and Clara by the fire. The news of his return from the station with the forsaken bride had traveled faster than a prairie fire. At the Mercantile, the whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves. "Took her in, can you believe it?" one woman murmured behind her hand. "That poor man. He's not thinking straight since the robbery. She'll milk him for pity, you mark my words." Another added, her voice sharp with judgment. "A woman like that, she knows how to play on a man's weakness." At the blacksmith's forge, the talk was cruder. A giant like Boone brought low by a cast-off. Guess he was more desperate than any of us knew. The gossip was a swarm of biting flies. Jacob ignored it, his face a mask of stone, but he felt each sting not for himself, but for the woman back at his ranch. He bought flour sugar and a bolt of warm wool flannel, paying with the few coins he had left. When the clerk, a man he'd known for years, gave him a look mixed with pity and disapproval, Jacob simply stared back until the man lowered his eyes. He returned to the ranch to find DeCessie by the fence watching the road. When she saw the wagon, her shoulders, which had been tense and high, relaxed. Clara ran out to meet him, her face alight, shouting Papa with a joy that momentarily eclipsed the town's venom. The days that followed fell into a fragile routine. Jacob was consumed by two silent, warring purposes. By day he worked the ranch with a feverish intensity, mending fences, tending to his dwindling herd, fighting to keep his world from collapsing. But by night, after DeCessie and Clara were asleep, he would sit at the table with Sheriff Brody's map, a single candle burning, and trace the outlaw's cold trail. The name Blackwood echoed in his mind. Silas Blackwood was a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in Harmony Creek. He was a land baron from the South, a man of immense wealth and influence, who had been steadily buying up failed ranches and homesteads, consolidating his power. But there was no concrete link, nothing to connect a man of his stature to a common bank robbery. It was just a direction, a dead end. He began his investigation quietly. He spoke to ranch hands who had lost their jobs, to Blackwood's acquisitions, to shopkeepers who were beholden to his credit. He learned that Blackwood was rarely seen operating through a network of ruthless foremen. He was a phantom, much like the man who had stolen his locket. Meanwhile, DeCessie was creating a home from the raw materials of his grief. She spoke little, sensing his preoccupation, but her actions spoke volumes. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire and bake bread, its warm scent a welcome ghost in the morning chill. She found Sarah's old sewing basket and mended Clara's torn sleeves with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and slowly, gently, she began to push back the silence. One evening, as snow rattled the window panes, Clara came down with a fever. Her small body burned her breaths, coming in shallow rasps. A cold panic, sharp and familiar, clenched Jacob's chest. It was a fever just like this that had taken Sarah. He stood frozen, a helpless giant, the past rising up to choke him. But before he could be consumed by it, Dessessy was there. She moved with a calm urgency, pressing cool, damp cloths to Clara's brow, whispering a lullaby that was cracked and off-key, but immeasurably soothing. She held Clara through the long, dark night, her own eyes heavy with exhaustion. But she did not falter. Jacob stood in the doorway, a shadow cast by the firelight, and watched. He watched this stranger, this woman the world had deemed worthless, fight for his daughter's life, with a ferocity that matched his own. She was not his wife, not his kin. Yet she battled the encroaching darkness as if Clara were her own flesh and blood. In that moment, watching her, his obsession with the past, with the locket, felt small. Revenge was a cold, empty thing. The warmth in this room, the fierce, protective love Dessessy showed for his child, that was real. It was a flickering candle in the vast, oppressive darkness of his life. By dawn, Clara's fever broke. She slept peacefully, her cheeks flushed, but her breathing steady. Dessessy, slumped in the chair beside the bed, was asleep, her face pale with fatigue. Jacob stepped forward, his heavy boots silent on the wood floor. He gently took the blanket from the foot of the bed and draped it over her shoulders. His rough hand lingered for a moment on the worn fabric, a touch so light she didn't stir. Outside, the snow continued to fall, whispering against the glass. Inside, a fragile thread had been woven between three lonely souls. Jacob Boone, who had been hunting a ghost from his past, looked at the woman asleep beside his child, and realized with a tightening in his chest that he might have just found a reason to fight for the future. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, as if winter itself was unwilling to release its grip on the high prairie. The snow receded, leaving the earth brown and sodden, and the days grew longer, filled with a pale, watery sunlight. Inside the Boone cabin, a different kind of thaw was taking place. The heavy silence that had once defined the home began to recede, replaced by the small sounds of a life being lived. Clara's laughter, the soft hum of Dessessy's voice, as she worked the steady rhythm of Jacob's axe splitting wood for the spring planting. Jacob's quest had not ended, but it had changed. His nightly ritual with the map continued, but now it was tempered by the reality of the two lives that depended on him. His investigation into Silas Blackwood became more methodical, less driven by raw rage. He rode to neighboring counties, speaking to anyone who had dealings with the man. The picture that emerged was of a chillingly efficient operator. Blackwood never used overt violence. His weapon was the law, the pen, the foreclosure notice. He preyed on misfortune, drought, disease, debt, acquiring land for pennies on the dollar. He was building an empire on the ruins of other men's dreams. And his empire was expanding northward toward Harmony Creek, toward Jacob's ranch. He felt a cold certainty that the bank robbery had not been about the cash. It had been an attack on the town's stability, a manufactured crisis designed to weaken the local landowners, making them ripe for Blackwood's picking. But the personal nature of the attack, the theft of the locket, still gnawed at him. There was a missing piece to the puzzle. One afternoon, while cleaning out the small, dusty attic, Dessessy found a small cedar chest tucked away under the eaves. It was Sarah's. Hesitantly, she brought it down to Jacob. "I found this," she said quietly. "I thought you should have it." He stared at the box as if it were a coiled snake. He hadn't touched it since the day he'd packed it away, locking up his memories with its contents. He nodded curtly, his jaw tight, and placed it by the hearth. He did not open it. Dessessy, respecting his silent grief, did not press. But her presence had already begun to change the way he saw the past. She did not try to replace Sarah. She simply filled the emptiness Sarah had left behind. She brought order to his chaotic home, warmth to his cold hearth and a gentle, steady affection to his daughter that he himself struggled to show. He began to notice small things about her, the way she shielded her eyes to watch a hawk circle in the sky, and the quiet pride she took in a perfectly baked loaf of bread, and the way she would read to Clara from a worn copy of the Bible. Her voice soft and even. He found himself leaving small offerings for her, a cluster of early spring wildflowers left on the table, a rickety chair mended without comment, a new sharper blade for her kitchen knife. They were his words, his silent acknowledgments of her place in their lives. One evening, after Clara was asleep, DeCessy sat by the fire, mending one of Jacob's shirts. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but comfortable, companionable. "I waited 3 days at that station," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up from her work. "The man who was supposed to meet me, he sent a letter, full of promises, a new life he never showed. The station master told me on the second day that he'd heard the man had married another, a local girl with a bit of land." She paused, her needle still. "I thought I would die of the shame, to be so unwanted so publicly." She finally lifted her eyes to his, and they were damp but clear. "I never imagined this. I never imagined being wanted at all." Jacob said nothing, but he set aside the map he'd been studying. He reached across the small space between them, and with a surprising gentleness took the shirt from her hands. He examined the neat, even stitches, then set it aside. Slowly, deliberately, he rested his large, calloused hand on the table. He did not reach for hers, not yet, but it was an invitation, a bridge across the silence. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and a small, tremulous smile touched her lips. A current of understanding passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the separate griefs that had led them to this shared moment of peace. The missing piece of Jacob's puzzle arrived in the form of an old itinerant preacher who passed through Harmony Creek once every few years. Jacob shared a meal with the man who had known Sarah's family back east. Sarah was a lovely girl, the preacher recalled, sipping his coffee. Spirited, had her heart set on a young man from a wealthy family. Blackwood, that was the name. Silas Blackwood. Very intense, ambitious young fellow. Her father disapproved, thought him ruthless, even then. He forbid the match. "That's when she started writing to you, Jacob? Your letters were steady, honest? You offered a different kind of life." The world tilted on its axis. Silas Blackwood. The name was a thunderclap in the quiet cabin. The bank robbery, the stolen locket, the cryptic mention of a debt, it all snapped into horrifying focus. This wasn't about land or money. This was about Sarah. This was a twisted, decades-long vendetta waged by a man who believed Jacob had stolen his happiness. Blackwood wasn't just trying to ruin him. He was trying to erase him, to reclaim a life he felt was rightfully his. The knowledge was a cold fire in his veins. The fight for his ranch was now a fight against a ghost from his wife's past, a man whose obsession had festered into a poisonous hatred. Blackwood, no longer content to operate from the shadows, began to escalate his campaign. Jacob's fences were cut in the night, his well mysteriously fouled. A delivery of feed he was counting on was lost on the road. His credit at the mercantile was suddenly revoked. He was being systematically isolated, choked off from the community, every move orchestrated by an invisible, malevolent hand. The townsfolk, already struggling, were too afraid of Blackwood's influence to offer help. They looked away when Jacob passed their faces, a mixture of fear and pity. Through it all, DeCessy was his rock. She stretched their dwindling supplies with a quiet ingenuity, her resolve hardening in the face of the town's cowardice. "They are afraid, Jacob," she told him one night, her voice firm. "But we are not. We have each other." Her strength became his. Her belief in him shored up his own flagging spirit. Their hands began to find each other more often, a brief touch as they passed in the doorway, a shared grip on a tool. The unspoken affection between them deepened into a powerful, resilient bond, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. He was no longer just fighting for Sarah's memory or Clara's future. He was fighting for Dicessi, for the life they were building together against the encroaching darkness. The final blow came not with a whisper, but with a legal notice delivered by a grim-faced deputy. It was a foreclosure summons from the re-established bank, now under new ownership. The principal investor, the man who held the note on nearly every property in the county, was Silas Blackwood. He had 2 weeks to pay the full amount of his original loan, the money that had been stolen, or he would lose everything. It was a perfect, cruel trap. The very crime Blackwood had orchestrated was now the legal instrument of Jacob's ruin. All seemed lost. The weight of his failure was crushing. That evening, he slumped at the table, the notice in his hand, his head bowed in defeat. Dicessi came to stand behind him, her hands resting on his slumped shoulders. "This is not the end, Jacob," she said, her voice a bastion of calm in his storm of despair. "He wants to break your spirit. Do not let him." He looked up at her, at the unwavering strength in her eyes, and felt a flicker of his own resolve return. She was right. This was not over. But as he looked past her toward the window, he saw a rider approaching in the twilight. The man was one of Blackwood's foremen, a hard case with a cruel sneer. And he was not alone. In front of him on his saddle was a small, struggling figure with a tangle of golden curls. Clara. A primal roar of fury and terror tore from Jacob's throat. He launched himself toward the door, but he was too late. The rider wheeled his horse around, holding up a hand. "Mr. Blackwood wants a word," the foreman called out, his voice smug. "He's at his estate. Says he has something of yours. Come alone. And be quick about it. The storm's coming." He spurred his horse and galloped away. Clara's terrified cry swallowed by the rising wind. On the horizon, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised purple. A wall of dust was gathering, a monstrous, swirling cloud that promised to swallow the world. Blackwood had not just foreclosed on his land. He had taken his child, his entire world. And he had chosen the cover of a raging sandstorm to deliver his final devastating judgment. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sand and wind. The sky, once a bruised purple, was now a roiling, sepia-toned nightmare. Grit scoured Jacob's skin and filled his lungs, each breath a painful gasp. The wind howled like a banshee, a physical force that threatened to tear him from the saddle. But Jacob rode on his body bent low. Against the onslaught, his world narrowed to a single burning point of focus: Clara. Dicessi had tried to stop him. "It's a trap, Jacob. You can't go alone." She'd pleaded, her face pale with terror. He had gripped her shoulders, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. "He has my daughter." The words were all the explanation needed. He had pressed a rifle into her hands. "Bar the door. Shoot anyone who isn't me." Now, guided by a primal instinct and a desperate knowledge of the land, he pushed his horse onward. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. But the faint outline of Blackwood's grand estate, perched arrogantly on a high mesa, occasionally appeared through the swirling dust like a ghost ship on a phantom sea. The estate was a fortress, its stone walls and iron gates a monument to Blackwood's power. But the storm was an equalizer. The gate had been battered open by the wind, and the grounds were deserted. Jacob dismounted, tethering his horse to a wrought iron fence that shuddered under the force of the gale. The grand front doors of the mansion were shut tight against the storm. He didn't bother knocking. He slammed his shoulder against the oak once, twice, and on the third impact, the lock splintered and the door flew inward. He stepped inside, the howling of the wind momentarily muted. The entrance hall was cavernous, opulent, and utterly silent. It was a place of dark wood, polished marble, and gilded frames holding portraits of stern-faced ancestors who were not Blackwood's own. It was a history he had purchased, not inherited. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your way, Boone." The voice echoed from the top of a grand staircase. Silas Blackwood stood there, silhouetted against a tall, arched window that rattled in its frame. He was no longer a masked phantom. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his hair perfectly combed, his face handsome in a severe, predatory way. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, appearing completely unruffled by the apocalypse raging outside. "Where is she?" Jacob's voice was a low growl, the sound of rocks grinding together. "The girl is safe," Blackwood said with a dismissive wave. "For now. She's upstairs with a nanny. Unharmed." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Come. We have so much to discuss. Old debts to settle." He turned and walked down a long hallway, confident that Jacob would follow. Jacob's hand rested on the Colt at his hip, his every muscle screaming for violence. But the thought of Clara, helpless somewhere in this monstrous house, stayed his hand. He followed Blackwood into a grand, dimly lit study. A fire roared in a massive stone fireplace. The walls were lined with books, bound in dark leather. It was the room of a scholar, a gentleman. It was a lie. "Impressive, isn't it?" Blackwood said, gesturing around the room. "All this, I built it myself. From nothing. A man can achieve anything in this country if he has the will." His eyes, the same cold, calculating eyes from the bank, settled on Jacob. "You, on the other hand, you had a fine start, a good name, a beautiful wife. And you brought her out here to this godforsaken dust bowl to wither and die in a shack made of mud and logs." "You leave her name out of your mouth," Jacob snarled, taking a step forward. "Oh, I think not." Blackwood retorted, his voice dropping, taking on a venomous edge. "I have more right to speak her name than you ever did. She was supposed to be my wife." He crossed to a heavy mahogany desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a small velvet-lined box. Inside, nestled on the dark fabric, were letters tied with a faded ribbon. And lying on top of them was Sarah's silver locket. "I gave this to her the summer before she met you." Blackwood said, his voice thick with a long-nursed grievance. "She swore she would never take it off. And then her father sent her west into the arms of a simple dirt-scratching farmer, because he thought I wasn't good enough. You stole her from me, Boone. You stole my life." The pieces fell into place, forming a picture of mad, obsessive jealousy. "She chose me." Jacob said, his voice tight. "She chose this life." Blackwood let out a short, barking laugh. "Did she? You tell yourself that to sleep at night, don't you? You hold on to this romanticized memory of a perfect marriage. But the truth, Mr. Boone, is often more painful." He picked up the topmost letter. "She never stopped writing to me. Not for years." He began to read, his voice a cruel, melodic poison. "Silas, the silence out here is a living thing. It presses in on me. Jacob is a good man, a strong man, but he is as silent as the land itself. I feel as though I am disappearing, fading into the dust. I dream of the life we might have had." Each word was a hammer blow to Jacob's soul. He was being forced to look at a truth he had never allowed himself to see. Sarah had been lonely, unhappy. He had been so consumed by his own grief, his own silent battle with the land, that he had failed to see hers. "She died because of you." Blackwood's voice rose to a shout, his gentlemanly facade cracking to reveal the raging obsession beneath. You brought her to this wasteland, and it killed her. You owe me for that. You owe me everything. Papi. The cry came from the doorway. Clara stood there, her face streaked with tears, the nanny cowering behind her. In that instant, nothing else mattered. Not the past, not Sarah's letters, not Blackwood's madness. Only the terrified face of his daughter. Jacob moved. He launched himself across the room, not at Blackwood, but toward Clara. Blackwood, surprised by the move, raised his arm. He wasn't holding a glass anymore. He was holding a derringer, a small, deadly pistol that had been concealed in his hand. He fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. But Jacob had already anticipated it, using his momentum to dive, rolling and sweeping Clara behind him in one fluid motion. He came up with his own Colt in his hand. The two men faced each other. Pistols leveled the storm, howling outside, the fire roaring inside. In the middle, a child's terrified sobs. Kill me. Boone Blackwood hissed, his face contorted in a mask of triumph and despair. Do it. Avenge her. Become the animal I always knew you were. Your daughter can watch you become a murderer. The moral dilemma hung in the air, thick as the dust outside. Vengeance was a hot, satisfying fire in his veins. He could end it. End the pain, the torment. But he looked down at Clara, hiding behind his legs, and he saw not just her face, but DeCessi's waiting for them back at the ranch. He saw a future. Justice, not vengeance. With a roar, he fired. Not at Blackwood's heart, but at his hand. The derringer clattered to the floor as Blackwood screamed, clutching his shattered wrist. Jacob was on him in a second, and the butt of his pistol striking Blackwood's temple with the same brutal force he himself had suffered in the bank. Blackwood crumpled to the floor unconscious. Jacob scooped Clara into his arms, holding her tight, his cheek pressed against her hair. It's over, little bird, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. It's all over. He turned his back on the unconscious man, on the letters on the locket lying on the desk. He carried his daughter out of the dark, opulent prison and back into the raging, cleansing storm. He had faced the ghost of the past, and he had chosen the future. The sandstorm broke with the dawn, its fury spent. The wind died down to a weary sigh, and a clean, rain-washed light spread across the prairie. The air was fresh and cool, the world scrubbed clean. As Jacob rode back toward the ranch, Clara asleep in his arms, it felt as though he too had been scoured of a long festering poison. He saw DeCessi before she saw him. She was standing by the fence, the rifle still held loosely in her hands, her figure a small, solitary silhouette against the vast, empty landscape. She had been waiting there all night. When she saw them, she dropped the rifle and ran, her feet stumbling on the muddy ground. She didn't speak. She simply threw her arms around both of them, her tears of relief warm against his cheek. Jacob, a man who had held his emotions in an iron grip for years, leaned his head against hers and let the tension, the fear, and the rage finally drain out of him. In the quiet solidarity of that embrace, surrounded by the two people who formed the center of his world, he found a peace he thought he had lost forever. Sheriff Brody and a posse, guided by the tracks Jacob had been too desperate to hide, arrived an hour later. They found Silas Blackwood bound and waiting, his empire of deceit and revenge ready to crumble. The stolen money was recovered, the locket among it. Blackwood's reign of terror was over. The town of Harmony Creek and Jacob's ranch was safe. The days that followed were quiet, filled with a gentle, healing stillness. The land began to recover from the drought, tiny shoots of green pushing up through the damp earth. The ranch, once a place of silent grief, began to breathe with life. One evening, Jacob and DeCessi sat together on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon in hues of violet and rose. Clara played nearby, her laughter a soft melody on the evening air. The locket lay on the small table between them. Jacob finally broke the silence. He told her everything. About Sarah, about Blackwood, and about the painful truth of the letters. He spoke of his idealized marriage, of the guilt he now felt for not seeing his wife's loneliness. His voice was low and halting, the words pulled from a place of deep vulnerability. "I thought our love was enough to conquer this land," he admitted, his gaze distant. "I was wrong. I was so busy fighting the world outside, I didn't see the battle she was losing inside." DeCessie listened without judgment, her hand finding his. When he was finished, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "The past is a ghost, Jacob. You can let it haunt you, or you can learn from it. Sarah's story is a sad one, but it is not your story. It is not our story." She was right. His love for Sarah had been real, but it was a memory, a chapter that was now closed. His love for DeCessie was a living, breathing thing, a partnership built not on a youthful dream, but on shared hardship, mutual respect, and a quiet, profound understanding. It was a love that had taken root in the hard soil of their lives and blossomed against all odds. He stood up and walked into the cabin. He returned with a small cedar chest that had been Sarah's. He opened the lid and gently placed the silver locket inside alongside her other belongings. He closed the lid, the soft click echoing in the quiet evening. It was an act of letting go, of honoring the past without being imprisoned by it. He then turned to DeCessie. From his pocket he pulled a small object. It was a wooden bird, a bluebird that he had carved himself in the quiet hours of the past few days. Its lines were simple but graceful, the wood sanded smooth as silk. He pressed it into her hand. "I couldn't have survived this without you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You and Clara, you are my home." Tears welled in DeCessie's eyes as she closed her fingers around the small bird. It was not a silver trinket haunted by the past, but a promise of the future carved from the sturdy, resilient wood of their own land. Clara ran to them, then wrapping her arms around both their legs. Jacob lifted her up, settling her on his hip. He put his other arm around DeCessie, drawing her close. The three of them stood together, a family forged not by convenience or shared grief, but by a resilient and hard-won love. They watched as the last sliver of sun disappeared, leaving the sky awash with the first faint pinpricks of stars. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. The silence that surrounded them was no longer empty or oppressive. It was peaceful, whole, and filled with the unspoken promise of all the sunrises yet to come.